Welcome back to this introductory series of talks on exploring English using online corpora. Today we're going to address some issues in grammatical description using corpus data, what are sometimes called data-driven grammars. More information on this topic can be found in our book, Exploring English with Online Corpora, the second edition, written by Wendy Anderson and me, John Corbett. Now, strange as it might seem, the study of grammar has rather a vexed relationship with corpus linguistics, so we'll begin today by looking at the relationship between corpus studies and grammatical theory. We'll look at the use of data before computerized corpora, and we'll reflect very briefly on the changes that computerized corpora have brought to grammatical theory and description. We'll rocket through the development of data-driven grammars. And we'll look at the kind of information you can get from untagged corpora and tagged corpora, and we'll answer a few questions about grammar with and without tags. And we'll consider some caveats or things we need to be cautious about when exploring grammar with corpora. And then we'll sum up today's session. To contextualize the relationship between corpus linguistics and grammar, I'm going to have to compress about a century of linguistic theory into about 2 minutes. So hold tight, and if you're unfamiliar with this narrative, you might want to replay this part of the recording a few times. The father of modern linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure, the Swiss scholar, is rightly famous for formulating some key concepts in the study of language. It was Saussure who distinguished between what he called langue, which is the system of language, if you like, its abstract rules or its grammar, and parole, which refers to the utterances that people actually make in speech and writing, the evidence for the abstract rules of langue. Linguists reflect on parole and they formulate langue, its basic linguistic methodology, or so you would think. Saussure also encouraged modern linguists to consider the state of the language now, to think of the rules of language synchronically, rather than thinking of the evolution over time of those rules, and that's a diachronic approach to language. And Saussure made a distinction between two types of linguistic relation that form the basis of linguistic study. Paradigmatic relations, what can be substituted in an utterance, for example, nouns and pronouns can be substituted for one another, and what makes something a verb is that it can be substituted for other verbs. And syntagmatic relations, or rules of combination. How are things like nouns and verbs combined to make a grammatically acceptable sentence in a language? So Saussure, if you like, provided a goal and a methodology for modern grammarians. The goal is to formulate the rules of langue as they account for the language now. And the method is to use paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations to frame those rules. Now, this kind of linguistic procedure informed the work of Europeans like Franz Boas, who emigrated to the United States to do anthropological fieldwork on the fast disappearing Native American languages. The linguistic anthropologists applied their knowledge of how language works to recording fast disappearing and to the Europeans exotic tribal languages. Their experiences in the field fed into the work of Leonard Bloomfield, whose book Language, published in the 1930s, argued that grammatical structures are sequences of ever smaller constituents. And so sentences can be divided into clauses, clauses into phrases, phrases into words, and words into ultimately the smallest grammatical constituent, the morpheme. Leonard Bloomfield initiated a strong American tradition in grammar that privileged form over meaning. One of his followers, Charles Fries, developed Bloomfield's legacy by considering the distribution of forms in sentences. And Fries went so far as to reclassify familiar parts of speech. He stops talking about nouns and verbs, for example. And Fries focuses very much on what can be substituted and what can be combined in English. Two later major competing theories of grammar rather react against the Bloomfieldian approach to theory and practice. Famously, Noam Chomsky sought to refashion the goal and method of grammatical theory by arguing that we should not be concerned with langue, but with competence, which is an individual's knowledge of grammar, an individual's knowledge of how to produce acceptable sentences. As with Saussure's lang and parole, we infer the individual's knowledge from his or her performance or utterance of acceptable sentences. While we can see parallels between Chomsky and Saussure, Chomsky's work was revolutionary. It redirected grammatical theory towards the construction of mental models of grammatical knowledge. And corpora are not particularly useful in eliciting the kind of data that is useful in this project. Native speaker intuition is sufficient. So Chomskyan linguists are a bit sniffy about corpus linguistics. A slightly more receptive grammatical theorist to corpora is Michael Halliday, whose systemic functional grammar harks back to an earlier European preoccupation with meaningful forms. For Halliday, a grammar is a set of meaningful choices that have formal implications. The choice between singular and plural, for example, is a meaningful choice that usually has an explicit formal implication. We change the form of singular and plural nouns in many languages, including English. Corpora can provide evidence for these meaningful formal distinctions. But it was John Sinclair, one of the pioneers of corpus linguistics, who developed the notion of data-driven grammars. In a way, the corpus returns us to Saussure. We suddenly have access to a wealth of parole. Can we use it to describe the rules of language that a speech community adheres to? Phew. Well, the main point of this whirlwind history of grammatical theory is that not all grammatical theorists are driven by data, that is, by corpus evidence. For some grammatical theorists, intuition and perhaps a limited set of data are sufficient. And so a case needs to be made for the use of corpora by grammarians. And the case for corpus grammar tends to be made on several grounds. First, the evidence for grammatical description is naturalistic, rather than based on a linguist's made-up examples or a teacher's prejudices. Secondly, the evidence for grammatical description is based on a range of varieties and styles. The grammarian is not limited to his or her own linguistic repertoire. Third, if the corpus is well designed, we can generalize from it. For example, if it is coca, then we have a fair representation of current American English, written and spoken, arguably. And finally, and perhaps most crucially, corpora, if used well, can show us patterns that we would normally not have noticed before. It can give us information that lies beyond the normal powers of individual intuition. Often you can analyze corpus data, a set of concordance lines, for example, and say, I hadn't noticed that before. Before we launch into our corpus-informed analyses of grammar, I do want to think a little more about the history of data in grammatical description. Some pre-corpus grammarians took data very seriously. One of my favourite grammar books is The Structure of English by Charles Friess, mentioned earlier. I love the introduction. Friess says, "The materials which furnished the linguistic evidence for the analysis and discussions were primarily some 50 hours of mechanically recorded conversations on a great range of topics. Conversations in which the participants were entirely unaware that their speech was being recorded. These mechanical records were transcribed for convenient study and roughly indexed so as to facilitate reference to the original discs recording the actual speech." That was 1952, republished in 1957. It would now be deeply unethical, of course, but can you imagine the work involved in recording, transcribing and analysing 50 hours of mechanically recorded conversations? Now we all have immediate access to hour after hour of spoken data recorded for us by other people, but kudos to those pioneers. Pioneers in the British scholarly community include those who worked on the Survey of English Usage from 1959. This manual collection, transcription and analysis of data finally led, 26 years later, to the publication by Longman of the mighty Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language, still an astonishing achievement, appearing just at the start of the corpus linguistics era. Like the pre-corpus dictionaries, these are fantastic scholarly achievements, often taking years if not decades to produce, and they are still very much worth referring to. But more recently, grammars have begun to appear based on corpus data. One of the first, the Longman Grammar of Spoken and Written English, was published just as the 20th century was closing. Notice the title, Spoken and Written English. With the development of spoken corpora, for the first time speech can be taken very seriously by grammarians. Notice too the publisher is again Longman. Corpus-based grammatical descriptions are, like corpus-based dictionaries, produced with a language learner very much in mind. The introduction to the Longman grammar makes a strong case for the use of corpora in grammatical descriptions, and it's a case that should interest the scholar as well as the learner. And I quote, "Through study of authentic texts, corpus-based analysis of grammatical structure can uncover characteristics that were previously unsuspected. For example, we have found that speakers in conversation use a number of relatively complex and sophisticated grammatical constructions contradicting the widely held belief that conversation is grammatically simple." Just over a decade ago, Cambridge University Press weighed into the pedagogical market with their comprehensive guide to English grammar, again spoken and written. This is based on Cambridge's international corpus, which is a considerable linguistic resource in itself. The Longman and Cambridge grammars are changing the way that we understand how the language, particularly the spoken language, works. But enough history. Let's think about what you can do with a corpus with respect to grammar. Now, what you can search for in a corpus grammatically depends on whether or not it's tagged for parts of speech. If it isn't, you have to search for words and word strings. So, for example, you have to search for she runs, he runs, they run, etc. individually, and you can't simply search for pronouns with the lemma run. You also have to be careful if you're searching for modal auxiliary verbs like may, because you'll also get proper names like the woman's name or the name of the month of May. First then, let's take a look at what you can do with a couple of word strings. Let's take a look at two possible contractions of the phrase he is not. Now this phrase can be contracted as he's not or he isn't. And imagine a learner asking you, which is correct, or which should I use? What does corpus evidence say? Well, the Cambridge International Corpus, as reported by McCarthy and his colleagues, has a much higher frequency of he's not and she's not compared to the alternatives with isn't. If we check the results in the BNC online, we find that they are confirmed. For example, in the BNC, we find 1,019 examples of she's not against only 167 of she isn't. And you can check the results against other online corpora if you want, Time or Coca or Now or whatever. Analysis suggests that patterns in the US and the UK are slightly different, but there is an overwhelming majority of occurrences of the he's not, she's not forms, particularly in the United States. The isn't forms account for 14 to 16% of UK usages, but only 2 to 3% of American usages. Now, this kind of corpus evidence about the frequency of grammatical usages, grammatical preferences if you like, feeds directly into English language course materials. The grammatical advice given in the Cambridge textbook, Touchstone by Mike McCarthy and others, advises learners that snot and not are used after pronouns, while isn't and aren't are used after nouns, like my boss isn't strict. A native speaker might say intuitively that he isn't is perfectly okay grammatically. I feel personally that there's nothing wrong with it. But the corpus evidence suggests that it is a relatively unusual usage, and learners can be advised to avoid it. Now, we can search for strings like he's not or he isn't in most corpora, tagged or untagged. But to look for parts of speech more directly, we need a parsed and tagged corpus. And since we don't have time, any of us, to analyse a 21st century corpus manually, we use automatic parsers like Lancaster University's Clause. Lawrence Anthony also has a free automatic parser that you can download from his Waseda University website. Now, there are obvious problems with automatic parsing. Good parsers, like Clause, claim 96 to 97% accuracy with standard written English, although speech is more of a problem, as is non-standard English. For standard written text, though, 96 to 97% accuracy is pretty good, and the 3 to 4% that is wrong should not worry us too much if our corpus is large enough. Parsers like clause have been used to analyse the online corpora in the Brigham Young University Corpus suite, for example, and we can expect a high level of accuracy there, though we will still find some mistakes. Another thing to bear in mind is that each automatic parser will have its own set of descriptive categories, and not all grammarians agree on those categories. Once you've parsed your corpus, however, you're rather stuck with them. BNC, for example, following John Sinclair's article on the subject, tends to separate of from other prepositions, and so of is tagged separately, and this obviously affects your search results. But if your corpus is tagged, you can do a lot with it. Tagged corpora are at the heart of Susan Hunson and Jill Francis's 2000 book, Pattern Grammar, which is an innovative attempt to identify grammatical patterns based on corpus data. The kind of thing that Hunson and Francis do in their book is to look at the grammatical patterns that certain words fall into. One example would be what kind of verbs come before over, when over is followed by a WH pronoun, usually beginning a clause. We can do a search like this in COCA using part-of-speech tags with over. The results are fairly obvious. If you look at the verbs here, you should see a clear pattern of meaning emerging. Fighting over who, arguing over who, bickering over who, squabbling over who, battling over who, competing over who. The COCA results confirm the analyses made by Hunson and Francis. For the pattern verb plus over plus WH clause, the verbs tend to share the meaning of argue or fight. And again, this is a useful pattern to teach learners. So, at the end of the day, corpora give us lots of evidence of the kind of paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations that make up a grammatical account of the language. In other words, they give us lots of parole, and we as linguists have to formulate lang from that evidence. We should be cautious, however. Corpora show us what does happen with a language. They do not show us what doesn't. That is, corpora don't give us negative evidence for grammatical rules. As a native speaker, I know that you cannot change a phrase like all the young women into something like the all young women, for example. A corpus won't tell you that that's impossible, but a native speaker will. Corpora may be skewed. It all depends upon their design. Even COCA is skewed towards unscripted media discourse for its spoken part, and so a lot of what might be said in everyday conversation, but not broadcast, is simply missing from the COCA evidence. Corpora also provide data, but not explanations, and data is never its own interpretation. We have to interpret the data as linguists. Not all corpora are suitable for all research questions. My own personal interests lie partly in Scottish usages, and standard corpora are not much help here, though BNC has some Scottish input. But corpora do at the very least allow us to study grammar as it is actually used, not as teachers or linguists or individual native speakers think it should be used or could be used. So, that was a rather lengthy discussion of today's topic, data-driven grammar. The great strength of corpora is that they give us access to naturalistic data that prompt us to go beyond native speaker intuition. There is a consequent focus on parole, performed utterances, and the social function of language, perhaps at the expense of a focus on cognition, which has otherwise been at the heart of grammatical study, at least in the Chomskyan tradition, since the 1960s. In the short term, then, data-driven grammars have meant a return to the social function of grammatical analysis, that is, accounting for the speech patterns of a community, and perhaps to helping learners to join that community, rather than suggesting mental models of grammatical knowledge. But as corpus linguistics develops, the chasm between the social and the cognitive might be bridged. Thanks for watching.